Hey, so we talked about the Indian Act and the role that it played in the imposing of laws on the indigenous people. And now we're going to talk about the Métis people and Inuit under the Indian Act. So, in the Indian Act and earlier laws, the government's definition of Indian did not specifically include Inuit or Métis people. So, remember that Métis is the combination of uh, a mother that's indigenous and a father that's of European descent. In the late 1800s, there were very few permanent European settlers in the Arctic region, so the government largely ignored Inuit and their rights. British colonial governments did not recognize Métis people as Indians, even though Métis people and First Nations were often very interconnected through marriage and kinship systems. When negotiating treaties, the government left it up to the leaders of First Nations to decide whether to include people of mixed European and First Nations ancestry. Now, this is important. The Treaty 3 Métis adhesion between 1871 and 1921, the Canadian government and First Nations entered into a series of 11 treaties called the Numbered Treaties. In 1873, the government made the only treaty in that period that officially included the Métis Treaty 3. Anishinaabe chiefs involved in the negotiations insisted that the Métis living around and among their people needed to be included. The government finally agreed and added a Métis section known as the half-breed adhesion to Treaty 3. The offensive term half-breed was used to describe Métis people during this time, and it's no longer used today because, for obvious reasons, it's offensive. So this photo shows a Métis man, George McPherson, who's seated right here, and his family. McPherson worked for the Hudson's Bay Company. He acted as a translator and negotiator during the Treaty 3 process. So, why were Métis translators important in the treaty process? Well, because as we learned in some previous video, the translation process is very important. So, if we have someone who speaks both languages, then the clarity and meaning and intention of that treaty will hopefully be fair. The Métis and Treaty 4. When Treaty 4 was being negotiated in 1874, the government placed limits on how the Métis could enter the treaty. Only the Métis who are willing to be classified as Indians and who are accepted by the First Nations named in the treaty could join. So there were still a lot of rules and stipulations as far as being recognized and being able to have that Indian status. So this comment was made by Chief Mawedo Peneus in 1873 during Treaty 3 negotiations. It provides an example of First Nations demands for government recognition of the Métis. So First Nations wanted Métis to be recognized by the government. Those children that we call the half-breed, those that have been born of our women of Indian blood, we wish that they should be counted with us and have their share of what you have promised. We wish you to accept our demands. So they wanted the Métis to be included. So what can you infer from his comment about who his people considered to be an Indian? Whereas the half-breeds, so here's an excerpt from the half-breed adhesion made to Treaty 3 in 1873. Whereas the half-breeds are above described by virtue of their Indian blood, claim a certain interest or title in the lands or territories in the vicinity of Rainy Lake and the Rainy River, for the commutation or surrender of which claims they ask compensation from the government, that they hereby fully and voluntarily surrender to Her Majesty the Queen to be held by Her Majesty and her successor forever, and any and all claims, right, title, or interest which they, by virtue of their Indian blood, have or possess in the lands or territories above described. That the said half-breeds, keeping and observing on their part the terms and conditions of the said treaty, shall receive compensation in the way of reserves of land, payments, annuities, and presents in manner similar to that set forth in the several respects for Indians in the said treaty. So what benefits did Treaty 3 promise to the Métis? It promised Rainy River and Lake Metis would receive the same reserves, payments, and other presents that Treaty 3 Indians received. So they're just wanting the same rights that other Indigenous people received.